I wouldn't begin to name them all. The activists, the defenders of human rights, and the environmental defenders all play a signal role. So too those who care for persons in a situation of vulnerability. The challenges in the region are huge. And we must recognize that this crisis has absolutely stripped away any possible camouflage of xenophobia and different discriminations. We cannot allow that to persist, nor can we go backwards. We must understand the value of diversity, the critical need to uphold it, and to understand that more rights for more people must be without any kind of bias. I won't list them all, you know which they are. But for a renewed region based on renewed countries, bluntly, no one can be left behind. Families have certainly shouldered a very great deal of the responsibility that we need to move forward. And in a spirit of solidarity, we must stay attuned to those who need us most. We need more work for all. We have 12 different women here who are strong defenders of human rights. Some are heads of households, some are top managers. Anything you have to say from whichever your platform shall always be listened to with respect. So too, representatives of Afro-descendants, of autochthonous peoples, representatives of the private sector, different coalitions of works, the young people. We know that each one of you, wherever you are toiling, whatever your group and whatever your area of endeavor, you have a valuable contribution to make. And anytime any human rights defender is tortured or killed, we will remember him or her, and we shall maintain our steadfast commitment to all of the different groups of our organization, the sectors, to always seek more rights for more people. Thank you very much. Thank you, Distinguished Secretary General, says the President. Let us now move to the first round of statements. We will begin with two spokesmen who represent millions of workers who belong to the major labor federations and unions in the Americas. Marta Pujadas, the president of the Technical Assistant Union, shall speak first. Marta Pujadas. Thank you very much. I greet you from Argentina, and I thank you for the opportunity to be here. Greetings to the President, greetings to the Secretary General, greetings to the Assistant Secretary General, to all of the members of civil society, all of my colleagues, men and women in the working world. We are here to speak for a renewed America. It is true, certainly, that the pandemic has thrown us for a loop here and in humanity at large, with some tragic consequences, and not least a deep change in our everyday life, in our social life, and the economies of our countries. In 2020, Latin America and the Caribbean began facing the worst crisis that it had known, and certainly the greatest contraction economically in the world. We know that a great level of unemployment, enormous drops in income are cataclysmic, and the pandemic has shown, has it not, something that the unions of the Americas had been insisting upon for a very long time: the need to bring in women, young people, migrants, and so many others who appeared to be lost in the shuffle, left behind. And obviously, there has also been an attack on the freedom of trade unions to meet and to take a stand. Many have been arrested. People feel threatened. The last time we met at the OAS Ministry of Labor's conference under an Argentinian chairmanship, I would remind you, we insisted that there be included a paragraph on the final statement that spoke precisely to freedom of association. we put forward the commitment, and I'd like to underscore that here, that countries should be absolutely determined to find more jobs for young people, to bridge the ongoing gaps that separate people of different genders. And the simple and complex, indeed, need to face that the difficulties in the labor world and the world of work for everybody need to be faced and need to be tackled. We said from the beginning of the pandemic that it was essential to keep collective bargaining, free association, and particularly the right to strike as platforms, absolute fundamental planks in the trade union world. And we are deeply worried, let me tell you, that a number of countries in the era of the pandemic and in the post-pandemic, a number of countries may feel very tempted to go ahead and whitewash a number of heretofore acquired union rights and skip them simply. We cannot allow this. We will not take a step backward in labor rights. Each one of them has been too hard to obtain. Ms. Buhadas, excuse me, you are out of time. Please end. I thought I had 4 minutes, but we believe in a free and organized social dialogue, and we hope that a world with social justice and sustainable development may be obtained. We wish to be present and have our say as men and women and lift up freedoms without violence, in peace and indeed for a renewed America. Thank you very much, Ms. Buhadas. We now move to the second statement representing labor. Julio Buhadas, the spokesman for Technical Advisory Services. Known by its acronym COSATE, the interpreter points out. A very good afternoon. I don't know whether you can hear me. I want to begin, certainly, as has our chair of COSATE, by reiterating her thanks and indeed the take she has given on the economic and social situation of the region, which has put workers in an even harder situation than they were already living before the pandemic, which was already a challenge. Ongoing drop in employment in many, many parts has meant a deepening of poverty. Now, the counterpart to that is that the grip of economic advantage on political issues is growing tighter all the time. All of this, let us be clear, threatens democracy and points to potential social upheaval, ongoing protest. And this is also certainly the case with regard to the health crisis itself, leaving aside the economic issues per se. We know that more than 2 million deaths worldwide are the result of insufficient safety standards on the job. Those are the facts. And that is why we, the workers, say that the right to work and safety on the job go hand in hand. And this must absolutely be seen to be ever more at the front in this context of the pandemic. Now, the workers of the Americas that are grouped under COSATE and the various trade union movements of this hemisphere all believe that sustainable development must be crafted with active participation of our people and not big financial conglomerates and transnational heavyweights. We need to ensure that growth is rooted in decent livelihoods, in a decent living, in social protection and equality that disregards differences in gender and any other distinctions. To increase public and private investment in strategic areas and infrastructure was already important, certainly before the crisis, and remains absolutely critical today. Why? Because here is the potential for developing decent work, respectful work, something that will ensure a fair and just transition. This means that ongoing training is also of the essence. This will be absolutely essential for people's ongoing careers. The various programs that have been put forward should certainly also buttress the ongoing formalization of the informal economy on basis of Resolution 604 of the ILO. We look to bring forward the world of labor, not to fraction it up into ever greater divisions. We look to regulatory standards through virtual platforms that will facilitate teleworking, that will facilitate dialogue and cooperation, so that certainly the region can boost its productivity, but not at the cost of ever greater discrepancies in the labor world. The interpreter regrets we've lost the speaker. The president, I respectfully remind you that there is a 3-minute limit to each statement. And I will ask the next 5 to ask Shanti Bennett, Clarelina Tarrayato, Pablo Ortega, and Stacy Velasquez. I would ask these speakers to be ready to intervene in turn. I will start then with the coalitions, with the representative of young people. Mr. Shanti Bennett will speak, and we look forward to hearing you.
Largest in history, 1.8 billion, and almost 90% of them living in developing countries, says the United Nations. Good afternoon to each of the OAS delegations and authorities. Special guests and young people who are following the live broadcast from all over the continent. My name is Shani Bennett, Plattolina Tarrayato a 25-year-old Jamaican, and today I have the honor to represent the diverse voices of young people who are a part of the Young Americas Business Forum, the official young participation process at the Summit of the Americas, coordinated by the Young Americas Business Trust. Today I have a special message. Young people should be seen as general partners for prosperity, playing an important role towards the renewal of the Americas. Yet, despite these troubling pandemic trends, young people have also been an energetic force at the forefront of developing creative solutions to an increasingly complex global economy. sustainable pandemic recovery. We remain optimistic that an inclusive, resilient recovery from the most pressing challenges is possible. With creativity and dedication, we are helping develop solutions to make sure communities emerge stronger than before. We're also aware of the environmental problems and of the importance of introducing changes that positively affect our climate. We reaffirm our commitment and support to find solutions to urgently address the reality of climate change. We ask for a more
Señor Bennett, disculpe.
holistic and inclusive mechanism. Youth
Mr. Bennett.
Invitar ahora a la coalición de derechos
I now invite the Coalition of Human Rights of Women in the Americas, and the spokesperson is Clara Elena Cardona Tamayo of the Health Network of Latin American and Caribbean Women. You have the floor, ma'am. Good afternoon, Mr. Secretary General and distinguished delegates. My name is Clara Elena Cardona Tamayo, a spokeswoman for the Network of Latin American Women's Health. The organizations that are members of this coalition of human rights for women believe fundamentally that a renewed America would be America that sees women as citizens with the same conditions of equality, equity, and opportunity. However, the cases of femicide, violence, sexual violence, trafficking, and violation of human rights, the lack of migration, displaced migration, forced migration, the lack of guarantees to access of safe services, particularly the access to safe, legal, and free abortion, it means that the fulfillment of women's rights is a matter that must be on the urgent agenda of member states. Latin America is the region with the greatest amount of sexual violence. We are number 14 in the region. According to the United Nations, intra-family violence in 2021 increased between 30 and 50%, and the participation of women in the labor market dropped by 6%, and it's calculated that 56.9% of women work in the poorest section of the economy, made poor by the pandemic. 36% of girls in the region drop out of school because of pregnancy or forced pregnancy or forced and abuse, sexual violence, because they were in their homes, in addition to the increase in women who do domestic work. The pandemic has limited the access of women to sexual and reproductive health services, with an impact on appropriate care for pregnancy and abortion, as well as on the use of contraceptive methods. Between March and November 2020, the alerts for aggression against defenders of human rights increased by 123%. Compared to 2019. We particularly call out the systematic violation of women's human rights in Nicaragua. We request particular attention to the political situation in Haiti, made more acute by the natural disaster that more acutely affects women, and particular attention to Colombia, where in 2021 there have been 19 human rights female activists that have been killed. That's why, Mr. Secretary General, we urge you and member states to adopt urgently and without any delay the necessary measures that can guarantee the full exercise of human rights for women. and as well as girls in the Americas without any limitations and exclusions. The cost of delay are intolerable, and there will be no renewal in the region unless we overcome these huge gaps, including gender inequality, structural violence, and impunity and non-investigation of crimes committed against women. We believe in a better life for women, not one less. Thank you, Madam Cardona. We now will continue with the Coalition for Human Development, presented today by Mr. Pablo Ortega from the Human Life International Organization. Mr. Ortega, you have the floor. Actually, he has sent a statement of his intervention, so I asked the Secretariat to show his video. Good afternoon. My name is Pablo Ortega. I'm a husband, professional, father, and president of the Association Life and Dignity, Human Dignity in Guatemala. Regrettably, we've seen in the last few years principles that question the dignity and value of human beings that are wrong, challenge ideology, reductionist ideologies towards family and life, as if this was a renewal, which it is not. We will look at what these conditions mean under renewed America. First of all, it means more industrialization of advanced technology without paying attention to the deep personalization of human relations that we see, and the economic changes that is moving more towards welfareism and false economic equality, which experience demonstrates will lead to individual conformism and widespread. Instead, a real renewal would only be achieved through an economy that takes into account the free market and solidarity, support for individual efforts to overcome oneself, and respect for freedom of action and association, private property, and numerous families, all of these factors of human development. The second part is that their so-called sexual and reproductive health will give access to abortion, that is, to killing a baby. The other measures are against life, insisting on the anachronic population control. Second, sustainable development. It considers the world as if it doesn't have sufficient resources and has an exacerbated climate crisis, which they want to therefore, as a result of this, legalize euthanasia and abortion as part of the solution. Death of the defenseless. And the third is the broken up vision of human sexuality that denies the anthropological effect of affection, sexuality, and the identity in social roles, leaving those people who may live through this confusion without life and taking advantage of their activism for their own purpose. The third thing is that they emphasize consensus, even forcing some delegates present here to abandon the basic principles and values of human rights, which are natural rights and personal bioethics, which is leading human beings to move in a dangerous way. That's why we believe that international rights must respect human dignity from the very moment of existence, that is, from fertility and throughout their entire life until their natural death. That's why we cannot accept criteria of utilitarianism and just getting rid of the most weak. That's how dictatorships are born. A renewed America would be one where preserves the rights and dignity of every human being, because that's how you build authentic democracy. Thank you. Thank Mr. Ortega. And now I have a statement by Stacy Velasquez from the organization Trans Queens of the Night, OTRANS, as part of the coalition LGBTTI+. Ms. Velasquez has also sent a video of her intervention. Good afternoon, Mr. Secretary General of the OAS, Mr. Luis Almagro, and the Foreign Affairs Ministers of countries and civil society in general. A renewed America requires renewed legislation, change and overcoming of the laws of sodomy that exist in the Caribbean, and the urging of and the sanctioning of laws that recognize the rights of all identities and genders in the Americas for people such as trans and binary and children and adolescents. We request that there be a scientific evidence available to decide legal processes to treat VIH, HIV, and to renew the laws on criminalizing HIV. We would like to note that LGBT persons and people who are sexual workers includes men, cisgender, men, women, and trans persons and non-binary persons. And we continue suffering from our economic and social and cultural rights, particularly trans and non-binary persons who have seen their civil and political rights violated due to a lack of proper documentation on their gender identity. We request access to abortion for people who have the capacity to be pregnant and advance policies for the health of trans individuals. Often the relationship is between COVID and the realities of the economy have affected individuals who have suffered from the anti-gender and neoliberal policies. The pandemic, for instance, has allowed people not to exercise their sexual rights work. Root America requires access to and displacement of persons. Some have been moved because of the consequences of climate change, which particularly affects the countries in the Caribbean. Others have been hurt by violence, particularly violence LGBT people. And virtual workers exist in Central America. There are many trans people who are systematically excluded from education and employment. We demand urgent, concrete measures to stop the violence against LGBT persons and particularly against trans persons. We demand justice from our colleague Sandra Soto from the Corporación Sindicato Armando Joffre de Chile, who was sprayed with gasoline and put on fire. We demand justice for our colleague Andrea Gonzalez and members of the coalition. Andrea was killed in a transphobic attack that has not yet been investigated adequately and is still in the hospital. That's why we request a moment of silence during this dialogue as a symbol of respect for the human rights of trans and LGBT persons. Thank you, Mrs. Velasquez. And now I call on the representative of the Coalition for Education and Culture for Democracy, Mr. Jorge Omar Marquez Santamaria, from the Colegio Calacuaya, Tierra Nueva. Mr. Marquez, you have the floor. May I ask that you open YouTube, because there are people who are saying they want to see this and they can't in the chat. It's going out through YouTube video. Education has a fundamental role in the development of people. The more education, the more you overcome poverty, disease, and social weakening. We need public policies that ensure access and permanent education. That is the urgent need that needs to be carried out today in our continent, particularly given the mandatory health emergency that has set back the educational process by at least 10 years. In view of the enormous challenge that this represents, we have a request that programs free of ideology and enriched with leading edge educational proposals that would overcome our setbacks and encourage the use of science in education. In this format, it is important to have the participation of parents as well, not only to ensure that the content does not violate pre-existing rights, but also to strengthen the process in the family. It has been demonstrated that a family that is committed to education has better outcomes in education and a better education of the student. It also leads to strengthening the social fabric. The school and the family are the singular binomial that ensures education is of quality and has a significant impact on society. If governments continue to impose ideologies, gender policies, religious policies in their curricula, it makes it impossible for education to be genuinely a lay education, which is a violation of democracy, the separation of church and state, and the principles by which a family can educate its own children. The rights that are recognized in international treaties needs to be acknowledged. On the other hand, to include content that go against scientific reality not only lead to rejection by the parents, but the educational system. The education supervised by the state cannot be dogmatic and teach only a specific view of life, but must be based on empirical science. It cannot be based on ideologies that polarize society, forcing everyone to think one single way. That is particularly the role of school, to teach self-determination of the individual. That we must teach for freedom without adjectives, without content of hatred or division, with ensuring freedom of conscience, expression, and based on science and truth, because the truth liberates us. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Marquez. Next, I would like to call on Mr. Jimena Paula Cabrera Rodriguez from the multidisciplinary professional organization Paso Firme, who represents the coalition Opportunities for a Contemporary Social Order. Go ahead, Mrs. Cabrera. Distinguished ministers and representatives of states, since I am the youngest spokesperson today, only 15 years of age, but with the strength that represents the youth of the Americas, I am here to ask for a society without ideological impositions that dehumanize individuals and submerge them in gender ideology. We ask that we put an end to the false debate, to put an end to the right to life. Right life must be respected from the beginning, from conception, as has been distributed in international agreements and in the San Jose Agreement, the product of this assembly. The youth of the Americas ask the legislators of member states to issue laws based on science as the only truth with regard to the identity of human beings. Biological science is clear. You're either born a man or a woman. The peoples of the America believe in the freedom to decide about our own bodies, but with the responsibility of taking on the consequence of our actions. The youth of the Americas ask for a world free of violence, and that this concept not be manipulated for ideological purposes that justify violence to impose it among others. Violence has no gender. The youth of the Americas defend a natural and fundamental element of our society. That is the nuclear family, marriage between a man and a woman. That is the only model that strengthens the social fabric and ensures a lengthy existence. We demand that the Assembly protect this as stated in the American Charter. The youth of the Americas request an educational system free of any ideological imposition, based on the separation of church and state that ensures the development of all and not confusion. The youth of the Americas recognize the guardianship of our parents and reject the state to take over a guardianship as their own. We, the youth of the Americas, insist that this distinguished assembly safeguard the Spanish language instead of distorting it to take on foreign ideologies that violate the wealth and richness of our language. We demand for the freedom of religion and conscience as a single criteria for our governing our behavior. We support the right of professionals to having conscientious objection based on their ethical, moral, and religious rights as an intrinsic right of the human being that cannot be pushed by anyone else. The youth of the Americas affirm our vocation to defend the life, the family, and the fundamental freedoms. May life live, long live life, the family, and freedom. Thank you, Ms. Cabrera. Now I call on the coalition of the Ibero-American Evangelical Congress, Mr. Clotaldo Edwin Alvarez Marquez from the association, the Evangelical Neuquina Mutualist Association. You have the floor, sir. Could you please turn on your camera and microphone, Mr. Alvarez? Mr. Alvarez, can you hear us? Please turn on your camera and your microphone. It's important that we urgently inform public opinion because invisibility only leads to more violence. In this forum, we would like to point out one of the most violent violations of human rights, and it is produced to impose the gender philosophy as a hegemony or removing the intrinsic guarantees of human beings, such as the freedom of conscience and religion. At various national congresses, they are proposing initiatives to silence social groups, particularly the churches, with a hate speech, that telling them to stop predicating their doctrine that is based on thousand-year-old texts like the Bible, and call us who have a faith based on the violence is as if saying that 90% of the people in the Americas are intolerant and violent. It's false. It is the Christian organizations that is based on the Bible that provide medication to people with HIV/AIDS. We have education programs in sports and in human development that have sustained and expressed our desire to help people improve themselves, often more effectively than government organizations. The biblical doctrine is love for one's fellow man and is a solid ethical and moral message. Its influence and social benefit cannot be denied, and that's why to reduce it and accuse us and repress us and not allow freedom of expression is quite simply the beginning of persecution. Our request is the freedom to believe or not believe without any ideological or legal or criminal impositions. Freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, and freedom of expression for all without any differentiation. Freedom, religious freedom today requires that all states promote in an absolute manner in their constitutions and in their legal laws the respect and promotion of this very basic human right. For 2 millennia, we have believed in this. If you know the truth will make you free. May God bless the deliberations of this assembly. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Alvarez. Now I call on Mrs. Catherine Gonzalez Avila of the Foundation Buenas Noticias, who will speak on the coalition Building New Horizons. Go ahead, Mrs. Gonzalez Avila. Apparently she has connection problems, so let's move on to the next, and I'll take note so that when she connects, we can call on her. The next speaker is Mrs. Maria Lucila Esquivel from the organization called Unidas en la Esperanza de Paraguay, on behalf of their coalition, the rights of persons who exercise sexual work. She sent a video, and I asked the Secretariat to please put on the video now. Mr. Secretary General, Mr. Ministers, members of the official delegations, and colleagues of civil society, we would like to begin with a question. Do the governments in the region really intend to work to leave no one behind as the 2030 2030 agenda states. It's the third time we've spoken before this assembly, and until now we have not seen any concrete example of response to our request. The COVID pandemic made the violations of human rights worse, and the non-recognition of our work. We did not see any assistance or public policies to assist us. We were forced to break out our isolation to work under full pandemic. We were left in our homes without money to feed ourselves, pay for services, or we had to go out to work and suffer violence by the security forces that repressed our work. In September of 2020 and 2021, 1,270 cases of human rights violations took place in 14 countries, many that have direct relationship to the lockdown measures, which were used as a means of increasing repression. In 40% of the cases occurred in the streets and 26% at their place of work. And more than half, that is 54%, of the perpetrators were of public officials. Only 15% of the informers submitted a formal accusation. 9 received a response, and 3 was to protect their rights. So we find ourselves in a continent with the greatest inequality, and COVID does not affect all persons in the same way. The levels of poverty are alarming, and in this context, we are continuing to work as if we had no rights. Another problem that became worse was the migration of persons because of economic reasons or violence or political instability, had their rights violated. We've heard others say that our kind of work needs to be abolished. But what happens in real life is that adopt measures that promote abolitionist sectors is wrong. We are being exterminated, and states need to guarantee to us the right to life, education, housing, work, and particularly the free election and choice for our bodies. We insist that the UN officials, the OAS, and other regional mechanisms do not disregard their mandates and put their personal preferences before ours. This, in practice, means that we need to have laws and legislation that recognize the rights that have been denied to us. This is why we request thank you, Mrs. Esquivel, for her words. And now we will conclude this first round of interventions with the presentation of Mr. Dean Lerman from the Latin American Union of the Blind, who will speak on behalf of the Coalition for the Dignity of Persons with Disabilities in the Americas. Mr. Lerman has also sent a video of his intervention. Please put his video on. The Coalition for the Dignity of Persons with Disabilities in the Americas welcomes the dialogue of the Secretary General of the OAS. The COVID-19 pandemic and all of its crises, the climate crises and natural disasters, continues to deepen the social, labor, wage, and digital gaps that separate people with disabilities from effectively enjoying human rights and fundamental freedoms, and prevent their full political, social, economic participation, and prevents them from participating in decisions that affect them. We will point out the relevant aspects that prevent persons with disabilities from having the social development objectives met. The World Bank has stated that during the pandemic, the prolonged closing of schools led to poverty in learning, which mainly affected girls and boys and youth who have disabilities. Those who traditionally do not have access to basic services, food programs, assistance technology, support staff, and recreation programs or extracurricular activities. And it also deepened the digital gap of the students with disabilities because of limited access to information, electricity, internet, and digital platforms and their content. The pandemic also increased by 4 points the poverty index, reaching 35% of the population overall, and reaching, and 13% of those are of extreme poverty. This led to inequality and meant a loss of jobs and income. Amongst other populations, the most affected are those who have disabilities because they receive the lowest wages, and in time, the cost of life is very expensive for people with disabilities. Given this situation, Mr. Secretary General, we would request that you submit to a study and consideration the specialized agencies of the OAS the following proposals: that we have a greater interaction and coordination of work between the Rapporteurship for the Rights of People with Disabilities of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and the Department for Social Inclusion, that a forum on disabilities in the Americas be established that would include the member countries of the OAS, as well as regional and sub-regional organizations who represent persons with disabilities, as well as their families. And that amongst its goals be to adopt a new structure of governance that implies a new means of financing development so that countries can confront the problems, the consequences of the COVID crises, the climate change, and catastrophes that affect disabled persons, to develop and implement public policies that guarantee the social application of international treaties to the development of national legislation to protect disabled persons.
Esta primera ronda de intervenciones quedó pendiente la conexión con.
I thank you very much indeed for your statement, sir, but we had to interrupt a previous statement. Have we been able to connect with Ms. Catherine? Apparently not. This then brings this particular round to an end. And I'm pleased, as previously explained, to give the floor to the member states for their intervention. And let me begin by giving the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'm pleased to be here today on behalf of the United States to hear the insights of these panelists and the recommendations as we prepare to engage in the 51st regular session of the OAS General Assembly. The United States strongly supports the participation of civil society, NGOs, and the private sector, and other social actors in the work of the OAS. And we recognize the importance of working together to advance our shared goals of democracy, human rights, citizen security, and economic prosperity. This year's General Assembly theme, Toward Renewal in the Americas, invokes a degree of optimism as we continue to deal with the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic throughout the region. Recovery from the pandemic will require the full participation of civil society, of the private sector, and other social actors, right alongside governments, to rebuild strong communities. In addition to rebuilding our economies, we must also continue to advocate for good governance, including transparency, accountability, and the protection of human rights. We are deeply concerned with democratic backsliding and the blatant disregard for human rights and fundamental freedoms, like the freedoms of expression, peaceful assembly, and association across the region. These concerns are most pronounced in Venezuela, with the political and humanitarian crisis that the Maduro regime has provoked. In Cuba, where the government continues to deny the fundamental rights of freedom of assembly and freedom of speech. And in Nicaragua, where on Sunday, the Ortega family dynasty renewed its authoritarian rule for another 5 years. We must find ways to leverage the OAS as a platform to hold governments to account. And to do that, we must support civil society. To this end, we look forward to hosting you at the 9th Summit of the Americas in the summer of 2022. The United States has long advocated for civil society to play a more active role in the summit process. And as hosts, we can ensure that this happens. We're proud to support efforts through the Summits of the Americas Secretariat, Citizens Forum of the Americas, and the Citizen Corruption Observatory to ensure meaningful engagement between civil society and governments throughout the summit process. Since assuming the chair of the summit process in July 2020, we have sought the views of civil society, the private sector, and government representatives from throughout the region on their priorities for the 9th Summit. In these conversations, a consensus about our collective priorities has emerged. The COVID-19 pandemic and the cracks that it has exposed in our health, economic, educational, and social systems, the erosion of democracy, the climate crisis, and a lack of inclusion and opportunity. At the 9th Summit of the Americas, we hope our leaders will commit to concrete actions to address these challenges and work with civil society and other actors to create opportunities for the peoples of the Americas. In closing, the United States welcomes the chance to continue to engage with all of you on the most pressing issues facing our hemisphere, both here at the OAS and in the summits process. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, embajador. Tiene ahora la palabra, embajador.
Ambassador, thank you very much indeed. I would like to give the floor now to the ambassador for Ecuador, Don Carlos Hatila. Mr. President and distinguished ladies and gentlemen, representatives of civil society, distinguished Secretary General, Assistant Secretary General, a very good afternoon to you all. I'd like to recognize the very valuable statements we have heard this afternoon and how important it is to seize this opportunity that we are given in a meeting such as this to have a real meeting of the minds and exchange our views. We have, since the pandemic fell upon us, addressed all of the different elements that have certainly been challenging: economic, social, labor, and so forth. And that is why the presence of civil society here is such a precious and valuable thing. Civil society mobilizing to seek concrete and important steps that will make a difference to people. The president of Ecuador, Guillermo Lasso, who took office just like month, has very much spoken on the importance of dialogue, of convening all members of society to speak out, including LGBTI, persons with disabilities, every different group, as we hear represented here and others yet, to come together to work so that our position can truly be inclusive and leave no one behind, as we keep saying. We want our action to legitimize the important action of civil society, to give kids a chance to learn, to grow a better life. And there is, for that reason, a great deal of wisdom, of course, in working more effectively in the health sector. We were able to vaccinate about 10 million people in the first 100 days the president had taken office. That's about 60% of currently vaccinated population, and we'll move up to 85%, which is the highest percentage of people vaccinated here. And we are speaking also, as of October 15th, let me tell you, we are now vaccinating children between 5 and 10 years of age. We are working very hard, of course, against climate change. And we understand how important it is to concentrate on entrepreneurship and a sustainable, innovating spirit as we have in the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. This was made very clear in COP26. We know that Ecuador has an extraordinary wealth in its marine territory. We are committed to work with the wealth of the environment and to respond to the innumerable ecologically friendly groups in the countries. And we understand that this does not necessarily translate into more inclusive communities, which is why we think training in the work sphere and in others is such an important thing. That's why we see civil society as an absolutely inestimable partner for us to work together towards greater entrepreneurship and innovation, as well as to launch our productivity within a sustainable framework. Ecuador wishes this challenge of the COVID to buttress our multilateralism instead of shaking it. We are working very closely with all of the inter-American bodies to ensure that there is strategic alliances being struck in all levels of government and the social sectors. This is why, yet again, we understand we must protect life and protect fundamental freedoms and work together towards growth that is more fair, more equitable, and more productive. You, civil society, which is to say you, the people, are those to whom we will have to account. Thanks very much. Thank you, Ambassador Játiva, says the President. Director Ana Isabel Carrillo will now speak for Guatemala. A very good afternoon to all and to you, Mr. President. Guatemala is the headquarters of this 51st General Assembly, and we take the opportunity to repeat and lift high our commitment to civil society in all of its activities and their important contribution to the framing of policies within the organization. This is the responsibility that we had in mind when, for the second time running, we are meeting in the General Assembly. This is, of course, a result of COVID-19. And in the process of preparing for this General Assembly, my delegation deeply appreciates the help offered by the Secretariat for Equity, the Summits Group, participation of civil society in all activities of the OAS. We're very certain that this space will lead to greater strengthening and better understanding among us on the basis of a fair and respectful communication amongst all of the representatives of civil society and ourselves. We're absolutely convinced that whether the civil society groups are local or broad international networks, their effect has made a big difference to democracy, the protection and promotion of human rights, the promotion of integral development and multidimensional security, as well as innumerable other initiatives that are the bedrock of the OAS and that are very much the backbone of this agenda. We will be pleased to continue facilitating communication, and we know that it is together that we will overcome the challenge of COVID-19. Now, the political constitution of Guatemala establishes, sir, that the state is there to assist every individual of the state of the country from cradle to tomb for the sake of peace, prosperity, knowing, of course, that the promotion and protection of human rights are indispensable to the well-being and the development of every Guatemalan citizen. President Alejandro Mante has therefore worked carefully to buttress the promotion and protection of human rights, to look at the importance of promoting peaceful and varied activities on civil society through COPAL. This is a framework in which we seek to promote dialogue to strengthen human rights, wherein different workshops are organized in order to buttress institutional capacity, and the means by which processes of dialogue and negotiations are strengthened. The idea is to make sure that democracy emerges stronger, that citizens themselves are empowered. COPADE works, therefore, as the coordinating unit of the executive and appreciates the participation of all of the institutions that work in human rights, persons with disabilities, women, autochthonous peoples, and young people. We chair the interinstitutional forum to that end so that institutional innovations in human rights can be studied and better implemented. Mr. President, we deeply value the participation of civil society units here and the forum that we share today. This is proof patent of how much we believe in our human rights groups in their various fields. Now, within the OAS, Guatemala has always been very much behind the themes that go to increased participation of civil society in the activities of the OAS and in the summits process. Now, the search for better equity, eradication of poverty, the elimination of discrimination, and so many other ongoing challenges will have to be absolutely at the heart of our ongoing work. Why? Because this will lead to greater well-being for each of our citizens. And that is why, again, Guatemala takes the opportunity to reiterate its solidarity and its good faith to work together to resolve common problems and to craft solutions that will make the difference. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mrs. Carrillo. And let me also express appreciation for the comments made by the other delegations who preceded Ms. Carrillo. We're going to have a 10-15-minute break. Please be mindful of the time so that we can begin. It's a 15-minute break. We will begin on time for the second round. Thank you. 15-minute break.
The COVID-19 pandemic brought unprecedented challenges to our member states and the people we serve. In response, the OAS Secretariat for Integral Development adopted a three-pronged approach by 1. Adjusting our portfolio of existing projects, 2. Exploring new projects to meet emerging needs, and 3. Expanding multi-sectoral partnerships. The results achieved in 2020 demonstrate the resilience of our member states and the commitment of the OAS SETI to work with member states and partners towards our common goals in the development of our region. Our Network on Competitiveness launched the COVID-19 Ideas Accelerator, sharing 250 tools, health solutions, responses, and recovery plans. The Network for Labor Administration published a portfolio of responses from ministries of labor to COVID-19, sharing over 420 measures taken to protect workers, employment, and income. Likewise, the Inter-American Teacher Education Network series, Teaching STEM in Quarantine, provided 117,000 teachers with key tools to continue advancing STEM education during the pandemic. Through its network and platforms, the Inter-American Committee on Ports promoted international and national best practices, guidelines, protocols, and recommendations on COVID-19 safety measures and continuity of logistic operations. Initiatives such as the Education in Times of Change platform allowed us to meet urgent needs by offering timely tools on virtual education and a dedicated space for ministries to share strategies, actions, and solutions. Other programs such as the Row Fund stepped up, providing emergency grants to offset the challenges imposed on our students by the pandemic. SETI's partnerships are adding value to member states in the form of technical assistance, training, and access to tools and services. In partnership with leading private sector institutions, we offered micro, small, and medium enterprises access to online tools and training, increasing their visibility and participation in e-commerce, a key to their survival and growth in the pandemic and post-pandemic era. A new OAS SETI Facebook initiative provided 85,000 MSMEs across the region with capacity building opportunities and WhatsApp business tools to aid response, recovery, and resilience building. The Caribbean Small Business Development Centers program achieved real impact, supporting new businesses, expanding sales, and driving growth. A new network of Caribbean SBDCs will broaden the program's reach. The Inter-American Committee on Tourism, the C2, convened ministerial-level policy dialogue in an urgent response to the impact of the pandemic on the hard-hit tourism and hospitality sectors. Policymakers and experts discussed biosanitary protocols, travel and visa facilitation, among other critical areas for the sector's recovery. Partnering with the George Washington University and the U.S. Bureau of Indian Affairs, we went ahead with the scheduled first Indigenous Tourism Forum of the Americas, pivoting to a virtual format and convening over 240 participants from indigenous communities, the private sector, and governments. SETI also integrated sustainable development practices in the COVID-19 response. The pandemic is a daily reminder of the links between water, health, sanitation, food security, and nutrition. We ensured the continuity of our water management projects in the Plata Basin and worked with governments and partners in the design of an investment portfolio valued at $90 million. Additionally, the Energy and Climate Partnership of the Americas continued to share relevant best practices and responses to the pandemic on energy and air quality. These few examples indicate our collective impact. We cannot do this alone. It is now more urgent than ever to address the region's structural weaknesses, to recover from the health, economic, and social crises occasioned by the pandemic and prepare for future shocks. It is imperative that we work together as we risk losing recent development gains and seeing millions fall back into poverty. It is time for the region to redirect course and pursue a more sustainable, resilient, and equitable future for all. We are in this together.
But the resilience building agenda is too big for any one stakeholder to address acting alone, and simply bringing together stakeholders, whether at the national, subnational, regional, or global level, is not enough. Effective, focused, and sustained coordination among stakeholders is paramount to provide countries with integrated and comprehensive support.
The OAS, as a hemispheric forum and honest broker, must continue to facilitate this process while we work with member states towards the attainment of the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. Cooperation, collaboration, and partnerships that include all actors strengthen us, enabling us to be more than the sum of our parts. We can and we must work together. The future of our region depends on it.
Me and my kids have been there for over an year right now. And children are friends. It doesn't matter where they come from.
Nosotros estamos en una zona netamente selvática. La línea de adyacencia va desde el norte hasta el sur, va desde Modesto Méndez hasta Aguas Turbias, tanto en el norte como en el sur. Esta línea tiene 215 kilómetros de extensión.
De allí vino él, se buscó creo con los de la OEA y de allí vino el proyecto para acá, para Judá. Y fue que lo dieron el terreno, lo dieron todo que era mano de obra y el material para hacer las casas que están ahorita. Y por ese motivo estamos aquí viviendo todavía.
La misión continúa trabajando en la implementación de medidas de fomento de la confianza mientras aguarda el resultado del reclamo que está atendiendo la Corte Internacional de Justicia por la disputa marítima, territorial e insular. Nuestra oficina en la zona de adyacencia realiza verificaciones a solicitud de ambos gobiernos, facilita reuniones y patrullajes conjuntos entre las Fuerzas Armadas y promueve una cultura de paz y cooperación entre las comunidades locales.
Children will be children and they have harmony. They don't see each other as a different country, but they see each other that they're growing together.
Go ahead, please. Good afternoon, Mr. Ambassadors. In our coalition Building New Horizons, we propose that the topic of equality between men and women can acquire the universal dimension, which has regrettably been sequestered by gender feminism, which is biological and violent, that does not represent most women's, and worse yet, the gender ideology that replaces women's rights and grants them to people of sexual diversity. The real battle for gender equality is the demand for just causes that are proposed by false rights and are regressive because they violate the right to life, ignoring and producing setbacks that cannot be reversed. We don't want justice just because of our gender. We seek equity because it's an inalienable right of the human being without race, skin color, or religion. We don't seek quotas. We seek that women be valued for their quality. And because of this, we want access to the same opportunities in education, employment, and development, and that the benefit be equal to any other individuals. Being a woman is a right. It's not superior or inferior to a man's. That's why it's urgent to recognize human beings as binary and complementary, equal to the law and equal to the rights and responsibilities of others. Sex should not determine differentiated treatment, but rather the ability to exercise your profession. We reject concepts of such as the economy of the woman and reproductive autonomy because we human beings need one another. Nobody can be discarded, and we reject that. They think that the agreements that are reached at this assembly should not just be on paper. We don't only serve the purpose of cleaning the house. Instead, we can work to help build a fair, just, equal society that provides opportunities to all men and women with respect for human rights without supremacy or antagonism. That's not what this assembly is all about. This is an assembly where we can all be heard and we can reach consensus. So let's start by the essential. Let every woman be treated with dignity, respect, and equality for the very future of our peoples, for the right to life, for education, for freedom of religion, for the family, for a renewed America. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Now we will move on to the second block of comments, and here we will hear the private sector representatives and coalitions from the civil society organizations and other social actors. We will begin by listening to the representatives of the private sector. And I would like to call on Mr. Herman Quiron, President of the Coordinating Committee of Agricultural, Commercial, and Industrial Federation in Guatemala. Mr. Quiron, you have the floor. Mr. Giron, could you please turn on your camera? We cannot hear you, sir. We cannot see you either. While Mr. Giron resolves his technical problem, let's call on Mr. Daniel Funes de Rioja, the president of the Business Commission for Technical Advice on Labor Affairs. Mr. Rioja, you have the floor. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Secretary. On behalf of CEATA, the Technical Business Committee that I have had the honor of chairing for many years, I would like to express my appreciation and to the committee and for the very active participation of social actors, both from the labor union and business sector. Secondly, I'd like to present two premises and 5 conclusions. The first is that the goal of the development goals, the SDS, approved on by all of the Latin America and the business sector in the Americas, and in which most of the countries of the region are difficult to implement because of the development conditions. And of course, this has been made all the more acute by the pandemic. Secondly, it's very important and urgent to have a strategy for the socioeconomic recovery of the region, which would allow us to speed up and promote development in our countries in order to achieve the common and inclusive goals we have set for ourselves. That's why I would like to highlight 5 points. First of all, the pandemic intensely affected the region, and we still see an impact of and a setback and delay because of the very low amount of investments in Latin America. Not only did the pandemic affect us, but the recovery does not seem to be equal or harmonious within the various countries. Secondly, the pandemic has also highlighted the weaknesses and vulnerabilities of our political institutions and democratic processes in the countries of this hemisphere. And here I'm referring to the rule of law, to the constitutions, the respect for human rights. All of that is fundamental. Exception cannot be used to express discretion in exercising the rights of citizens. Third, the crisis has created an opportunity for countries to build a better future. And that situation, that means that we have to assign a very important role to enterprise, to the business sector, to help support and bring about that development. Fourth, to create jobs, we need to have businesses and businesses in the formal sector of the economy. The informality and informal sector is a huge risk, and thus we need to develop a comprehensive development strategy that respects multilateralism and includes the financial institutions of the region. And finally, I'd like to point out that the role of the OAS, I'd like to conclude by saying let's see if Mr. Hernan Giron from CACIF in Guatemala has now been able to connect. Nope, he hasn't yet. So let's move on. And let's begin by listening to the civil society representatives. I'd like to invite Mrs. Natasha Jimenez Mata from the organization Mulabi, Latin American Space on Sexuality and Rights, who will speak on behalf of the Citizens Forum of the Americas. Mrs. Jimenez, you have the floor. She cannot be heard. I don't believe she has her mic on. We still cannot hear her. If you maybe you have Bluetooth on, disconnect your Bluetooth. No, we still can't hear you. Well, while we resolve this technical situation, let's move forward, and we'll come back to you, Mrs. Jimenez, in a few minutes. So let me now call on Mrs. Lucia Veronica Galopo from the organization called CAREP, who represents the Coalition of Human Rights in the Americas. You have the floor, Mrs. Galopo. Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary General, distinguished delegates. Every year we hear testimony from thousands of people in the region talking about the breakdown in standards of life and guarantees of rights, which force men, women, and children to migrate, many children unaccompanied. The pandemic has aggravated the historic inequalities in our region, and the measures adopted by governments to reactivate the health crisis has left many collateral effects that will impact the continent, particularly the most vulnerable, at least during this decade. That's why in our coalition, we want to work jointly with the states on the following points: that the states guarantee access to health, particularly to vaccines for refugee and migrant populations, regardless of their origin or migration condition status, and taking into account the economic consequences of the pandemic to include these populations in their economic reactivation plans, paying special attention to the informal labor sector, which is mainly covered by the migrant populations. The pandemic has limited access to protection for these populations. There has been massive expulsions contrary to international standards. This has pushed migrant populations to use informal means and live in crowded conditions, which risks their lives and integrity. We appeal to adopting measures to ensure safe, humanitarian, coordinated migration with due safety conditions, with a focus on human rights and gender perspective, guaranteeing the principles of non-return, family protection, access to asylum mechanisms. It's necessary to guarantee equality of economic rights and social rights of the migrant populations. We appeal to permanent, accessible, and flexible access to regular migration routes and to the status of refugee, and also guarantee to all persons access to health, education, housing, and all the other rights provided by international rights of refugees. The states need to consider the standards of human rights, allow for better context and timely conditions that guarantee responsibility to deal with the challenges in the migration in the current situation, and to pay particular attention to the groups that are most vulnerable, like children, women, LGBT populations, the elderly, and indigenous peoples, amongst others. The restrictions do not stop mobility, only if it's made to be safe and secular could we stop it. We must provide for these populations. Thank you very much. We have Ferdinand Giron. I don't see him yet, but I do see Natasha Jimenez. So Natasha Jimenez from the Latin American Space and Sexuality and Rights, you have the floor. Can you hear me now? Yes, we now hear you perfectly. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Warm greetings to everyone. Since the topic of the General Assembly was proposed, we in our civil society have been asking ourselves, what does it mean towards a renewal in the Americas? What does this mean in material and symbolic terms for our countries, and particularly for the demands of civil society when we're in the midst of a health crisis caused by the pandemic? It's not enough to use the words renewal, change, or transformation for things to take a different course or improve things for everyone. Towards a renewed America, it must require a stronger political commitment on your part, on the part of the states and the OAS, when we have these open dialogues use more innovative methodologies instead of just mere speeches. As the Citizens Forum of the Americas, we have been working for 5 years in developing regional hemispheric agendas that take into account the complexity of 4 important issues. 1, the fight against corruption, which in order to eradicate, we have to listen to the proposals made by the citizens. 2, civic space and the weakening of the rule of law, where the citizens cannot fully exercise their rights and freedoms, either because there are criminal agents or because the state does not guarantee it. 3, participation and advocacy during the digital era, where the governments must come up with innovative methodologies that include in-person virtual meetings to close the digital gap. And 4th, gender-based violence. Women and girls continue to be the population sector that has the most cases of violence in all countries, and yet the states are ineffective against the calls for justice. Thus, in this spirit, we have to make the following recommendations. Motivate citizen participation with strategies that encourage active citizen participation by providing tools for advocacy and awareness, citizenship, creating social groups, promoting the reports from civil society at the GA and other multilateral states so that they can provide input to measures that are adopted by the state at the multisectoral level, to document and denounce the violation of human rights and democratic weakening. In order to do this, we need to continue strengthening the inter-American human rights system. And we must demand that the actors that that work for social progress and fight for the defense of human rights are protected. And finally, that the states must ensure a real and effective transformation in order to eradicate poverty, exclusion, structural inequality that continues to exist in our countries and that impact the enjoyment of rights, particularly for those groups who are most vulnerable. Thank you very much. Thank you, Natasha. I now would like to call on Mrs. Lady Ayala from the Latin American Network of Health Women, who represents the network of adolescents and youth in the Americas and human rights. Good afternoon, everyone. In terms of the theme of this agenda, towards renewal in the Americas, we who represent youth and adolescents in the America would urge states to fulfill their commitments and not decrease their efforts, so that just to ensure that the rights of adolescents and youth are at the very center of their agendas as a priority. According to the last survey of the youth made by the UN, more than half the adolescent and youth population believes that gender violence increased in their environment, and women, the LGBTQ plus populations, indigenous, migrants, and refugees were the ones that were most affected. It's important to note that according to Amnesty International, threats against LGBTQ persons are of particular concern in Central America. There's been violence in Guatemala, Salvador, and Honduras. This means a setback in guaranteeing and protecting their rights. And this is affected by the figures on the negative view that youth have on the government's response. It's youth and adolescents living in poor conditions, who live in rural areas and are members of indigenous, Afro-descendant, migrant, and refugee populations, who are the most unprotected because of inadequate public policies that do not respond to the needs of this sector. Our region is the only one in the world where there has not been a decrease in child marriages in the last 25 years. The determinants of these births are the following: unwanted pregnancies in girls and adolescents who had to be led to birth as a result of the barriers to access of sexual and reproductive rights, particularly access to legal, safe, and free abortion. These words can eradicate more than 20 years of progress that has been made in guaranteeing sexual and reproductive rights. On the other hand, the lack of care to HIV persons increased during the pandemic. In the first quarter of 2021, 48% of adolescents and youth did not have any antiretroviral treatment. Thus, we would like to urge states to carry out the agreements made at the Santiago 2020 agreement, particularly with regard to implementing sensitive policies that are sensitive to gender inequality, to mitigate the effects of crisis in youth, to reaffirm the fundamental role that civil society organizations have, specifically women and feminist organizations, indigenous or Afro-descendant women, youth, women with disabilities, LGBTQ persons, and those who are defenders of human rights. Youth fight for a renewed, dignified, and democratic America, and we urge governments to work in a coordinated fashion with civil society to implement strategies aimed at implementing the agendas and commitments made, where youth are at the very center of all possible efforts. Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, let me now call on Hernan Giron, the president of the Committee on Agricultural, Commercial, and Industrial and Financial Industries, who has asked for the floor through Julie Perez. You have the floor, sir. This 13th Forum of the Private Sector of the Americas had the highest level guests to deal with the political, social, and economic challenges of our era. The event gave us much input to the productive sector, and I would like to describe the most relevant comments made. It's obvious that democratic institutions, the rule of law, and accountability are all necessary conditions for economic and political development of nations. And democratic institutions ensure the participation of citizens in the political process and bring legitimacy to states' policies. The existence of a strong rule of law gives certainty to private property and strengthens a business sector. It's an essential condition if we have an environment that encourages private investment at all levels. As a complement to the rule of law, accountability also requires that governors have a level of transparency and effectiveness in their public policies, and these conditions can only be achieved if there's effective separation of powers and society is able to organize itself and express itself freely. Unfortunately, in our region, we see a setback in the consolidation of these attributes in the past few years. We have seen how leaders have taken advantage of citizens' discontent to consolidate their power, to stay in power at any expense. And it's through that process they have dismantled the institutional counterweights in their societies. They have changed the power structure and weakened justice, press, civil society, and business organizations. These societies affected by these populist waves become authoritarian states with increasing social challenges. Our countries can only progress if we respect the law, we have elections, and we keep a separation of powers. With this great concerning trend, we would turn to the productive sector and tell them that they have two things we must do. We must support institutional and democratic actors to require accountability and counter the authoritarian threats. Secondly, we must promote the strengthening of institutions in our countries with the purpose of maintaining the separation of powers, which guarantees the rule of law. Only through this can the business sector carry out its main role, which is to create opportunities for the citizens in our countries and to continue to be the driving engine of development. I'd like to thank you for participating in this successful forum and ratified our role as entities that bring about economic, political, and social change. Rarely has it been as important for the continent as it is today. Thank you very much, Mr. Giron. And now let's continue with the presentation of Mrs. Irubina Hernandez of the organization Convergence for the Human Rights, a coalition of Organization of Human Rights in the Americas. You have the floor.
Nuestra preocupación por tres temas. Primero, por el continuo deterioro de la institución.
Speaking here for the Coalition of Associations for Human Rights in the Americas, I'd like to speak against the increasing weakness of judicial independence and separation of powers, as well as the erosion of the situation of human rights defenders. This reflects the growing authoritarian tendencies of our countries in the context of the pandemic. This, of course, the pandemic itself is an ongoing threat to ourselves and to the rule of law. El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Venezuela are there as pertinent examples of what I'm stating. We also, of course, uphold the right to freedom of expression and the incursions thereupon throughout the continent, as in the cases of Colombia and Peru. That was point one. Secondly, we're very, very concerned about the situation of human rights defenders in various countries, including the defenders of the environment, of sexual rights and reproductive rights, the LGBTIQA++ community, indigenous and Afro-descendants groups, all of whom continue being the victims of ongoing attacks, stigmatization, forced displacement, and other violences. 360 human rights defenders were assassinated in the region just this last year. This has got to be recognized in every one of the public works of our governments here. We're also equally concerned by the ongoing attacks upon historically discriminated groups such as women and, again, the persons of the LGBTIQ++ groups. That was point 2.3. We exhort the countries to truly make effective their presumed allegiance to the human rights regime in the country and in the continent. Rights have to be transparent and participatory. It's important to vote for the correct profile of people who believe in these rights to lead in the hemisphere and to allow the necessary freedom in all of the areas for which we renew. This great renewed and renewing of Americas that the OAS is holding up won't just happen. It's important for states to redouble efforts for the protection and promotion of human rights and to listen to the voice of the people and of human rights organized societies must be heard. Thank you.
Edwina. Tiene ahora la palabra la señora Graciela Durez, del Observatorio Internacional de Prisiones de Argentina, quien intervendrá en representación de la coalición Red Lat, Diálogos Incluyentes como base de la innovación social. Adelante. No la tenemos en no le vemos. Ahora sí.
Adelante.
Ahora sí le vemos. Adelante, doña Graciela.
Thank you. The COVID-19 pandemic made it very clear that a renewed and renewing America is one that must immediately tackle the impact of the crisis and that should take the opportunity to further strengthen the right of law, which, alas, in many parts of the hemisphere have been weakened over this time. It's important to further protect those who have been principal targets of numbers of groups, newspaper people and others, promoters and protectors of human rights. It's important that these various different groups of populations, boys, girls, adolescents, persons with disability, persons deprived of liberty, and so many others, must be at the forefront of our thoughts. So to the question of ongoing vaccination on an immediate basis, it is important, of course, that for the creation of national and international stocks, particularly in the case of low and middle income countries, must be at the forefront of our concerns. So too, interregional cooperation for innovation so that these important health initiatives may become self-sustaining. Equally, it's important to avoid duplication of efforts. It is also important to respect ancestral traditions in the area of health and native medicines. We believe there should be a compendium of these, better rationality in the context of purchase and distribution of vaccines, I should say. Telemedicine and health services in general should be buttressed such that these services become ever more accessible while we move to the digitalization of personal data. The aim is to set up a just and fair system. A renewed America will be an America in which human rights are respected. It will be a space in which governments will be the first to abide by the law, to work for justice, which should be timely and effective. Once renewed, the Americas should aspire to cease being the most inequitable continent on the face of the earth, so that all those who have yet to feel the blessings of democracy may aspire to it. Thank you very much. Thank you, Doña Graciela, says the chair. Let me turn now to Ms. Sandra Mazo, who will speak for the Catholics for the Right to Choose, spokesperson for religious coalitions, beliefs, and spirituality. Good afternoon. The context of the pandemic certainly poses a tremendous challenge to the Americas. This is an era in which our strengths as well as our weaknesses have become evident, and all of the cracks in our different means of living together. We need to aim for greater resiliency, as we seek to do when we work together, but we must also recognize the various examples of fear, of forced silence, and of violence that has arisen. If we dream of a renewed America, we've got to begin by recognizing that we've got a heck of a long way to go in that area. We must, not least in times of crisis, stand up for people's rights. The pandemic has shown that groups of different types, including religious and spiritual groups, have offered a safe space in which people can work for the common good. At the same time, we have noted that in some quarters, religious beliefs can be used quite frankly, as a means to legitimize certain views of democracy, which is not necessarily worthy of the name. We see with some concern the abuse of the idea of religious freedom as a means to smother other ideas and others' beliefs in speaking out. Religious space and religious beliefs need to be accepted across the board. Religious freedom cannot be used as an excuse to legitimize some views and squelch others. We're also very concerned that the presumed religiosity of some groups are, quite frankly, very repressive political groups, very excluding and not inclusive groups. Just as we are plural in our various views of different religious articles of faith, so too politically we have different points of view and should have the freedom so to express that. We believe in a lay state, a separation of church and state. That has got to be square one to build a democracy, and that is why we call out to the member states of this Organization of American States to uphold the profoundly democratic essence of what should be religious coalitions, to abide by the articles of the organization that speak of these issues, where there is very much importance ascribed to allowing a difference of opinion and freedom of religion, such that religion is a means of buttressing democracy and fostering democracy and dialogue in civil society. Thank you. Thank you, Mrs. Maso. I'm pleased now to give the floor to Mr. Zimmerman, who will speak on the American Coalition for the Use of Drugs, Policies in Drugs, or Drug Policy, I beg your pardon. This is Mr. Pablo Zimmerman. June of this year marked a half century, 50 years, since President Richard Nixon launched a war on drugs, which very quickly was felt throughout the Americas. And of course, it was felt by consumers and distributors throughout the hemisphere, and sought, of course, to interrupt drug routes. There was a specific attention to repression as a means of fighting the scourge. All of that may be, but we must certainly recognize that despite all of that repression, guess what? the consumption of drugs in our hemisphere sure hasn't dropped. It has increased. So we have got to think this through again. We must understand that a more comprehensive approach of the drug issue must take into account the biological, social, and physical elements that are included. We must give pride of place to scientific and more progressive policies that understand the importance of upholding human rights, the right to legal assistance, and that is why we call specifically on all member states to take a hard look at your drug policies and accept the principle of proportionality as a good beginning, understanding that there needs to be a good look at the kind of sentencing that is handed out for particular violent events and levels of criminality associated thereto. There must be a greater emphasis on treatment, rehabilitation, and social integration. A viability of the services in society that are supposed to offer those important areas of assistance. And all of these must, of course, be respectful of ethical standards in order that we can set up a network that really makes a difference by differentiating among these different elements. Rehabilitation and treatment should be considered on a gender basis and an ongoing basis. It isn't a one-off overnight wonder. We believe that these questions have to be grounded in community application. Policies that end up putting indigenous populations in greater danger won't work either. Those who perhaps are cultivating some of these crops, but there has to be a better understanding of what can replace the cultivation of coca or poppies. That's important. But above all, a respect for human rights in all of these measures. It's important, therefore, that the international guidelines on human rights and drug policy should be paramount. And finally, we know that civil society plays a very critical role in upholding human rights. And so we exhort the member states, and the interpreter regrets the time has expired and the gentleman lost his microphone. We now give the floor to the Coalition on Human Rights and Sexual and Reproductive Rights. Thank you. We'd like to point out, first of all, that we, civil society organizations, consider that it's important that we should go from an exclusive attention to an inclusive focus. We should avoid ethnic, social, gender, sexual orientation, and so many other forms of discrimination and distinction. True inclusion that is based on peace and social justice should guide us in a way that we can better identify the innumerable means of oppression that continue to afflict us. For Latin America and the Caribbean may truly offer its citizens a means to live in peace and without exclusion, just hasn't done enough. The whole world knows that we are the region in the planet with the greatest discrimination, the greatest gaps in poverty and wealth, and greatest levels of violence, sexual violence, amongst others, against women and little girls. That was point one. Secondly, it is time to go from the talk to walking the walk. Little girls, LGBTIQ+, need our help, and that is why, as a coalition, we call on the member states to look very hard at how they can best renew their discriminating and and uneven policies, and to look to better restoration of justice of those who have suffered violence as a result of discrimination. It's important to set up an education that is not gender biased, but on the contrary, seeks to be more and more inclusive and addresses sexual health and reproductive health in a more equalitarian and effective manner. It's important to this end that there be a very firm separation between church and state. That is the only context in which true guarantees of the exercise of free reproduction and sexual education can flourish. We need disaggregated data. We need to reaffirm our commitment on the part of the institutionality of the OAS so that the rule of law and democracy offers America a true chance of moving forward on a renewed basis. I'd now like to invite Dr. Gloria Núñez de Silva to take the floor as the spokesperson of the Afro-Descendant Coalition of the Americas. The speaker is on mute, I'm afraid. If you could please activate your microphone. Terribly sorry, we still can't hear you. I hope you hear me now. All right. The Afro-Descendant Coalition of the Americas considers that it is very important to observe, first of all, that we are, quite frankly, very disturbed by the thought that we talk and talk, but our proposals are set aside. This hasn't changed. And as you well know, Afro-descendants in all your countries are in poverty, and ever more so. Our leaders are persecuted, prosecuted, and assassinated. Take your pick. At the end of the day, sure, we look at the people who are representing our states, and with all due respect, how many of us are sitting where you are? We believe very firmly that, quite frankly, a budget says a lot. And so when you look at the budgets that are allocated to the programs that are allocated to your Afro-descendant populations, you'll have a better sense of what it is that your country is really doing for us. COVID-19, regarding the Afro-descendants, is something that even the IACHR shows. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights has a rapporteurship after defendants, and guess what? It's the one with the least money of all of the rapporteurships at the Commission. That tells you a lot. We think that the ethnic and racial bias in public policy must be identified and worked against. We call out for greater protection for Afro-descendant human rights workers in Brazil, in Mexico, in so many countries of the continent, and equally so those that work for or who are members of the LGBTIQ++ community. We also feel that the Afro-Descendant Fund on Afro-Descendants should be indeed shored up. There needs to be more done to continue to work against racism and particular prejudice against us in the framework of the Inter-American Convention Against Racism, also the 2030 plan, and our own Afro-Descendant documents. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. To close this particular segment, Ms. Gloria, we're going to listen to Lourdes Banca Atención of the women's group from Peru for indigenous peoples and artisanal workers. Thank you. I hope you can hear me. Yes, indeed, Ms. Ayala, go right ahead. And a good afternoon to all of you. On behalf of the coalition, what is in fact the indigenous coordination of and by our indigenous name Abya Yala. I'm pleased to address you to tell you this is a framework in which we, in our territory, which we traditionally call and think of as Abya Ayala, as rights subjects. Now, we cannot move forward if indeed those rights are ever more diminished and as we are ever more chased off our ancestral land. We must be able to defend our territories and be able to do more to defend the rights that are there to try to protect our cultural and indigenous and cosmological position in these contexts. The original, the autochthonous indigenous peoples here have been here for millennia. We are the ones who offer food security to the world. We are the ones who know most about the need to protect the climate. We are rights subjects as the dwellers of Abya Yala. But if there is no recognition for the collective rights, as I have just expressed, if that is not collectively accepted, we call upon the heads of state and government so that the declaration that was adopted in 2016 on indigenous peoples that was adopted in the Dominican Republic and the Convention on Indigenous Rights should be immediately implemented. Thus far, not a single country in the hemisphere has abided by the terms of those declarations and the conventions. It is important that here at the OAS we set up a permanent commission on the rights of indigenous peoples. We call for that to be set up within the OAS and that it be integrated by our brothers and sisters of indigenous origin and that there be appropriate funding therefore. The Indo-American Legal Commission and so many other legal and juridical international groups seek to assist us. We ask that more be done, and we call on the members of the OAS to recognize the very special, the unique jurisdiction of the autochthonous original peoples in Abya Yala and our own justice and our own cosmovision, and we should be allowed to apply it. Most especially, we speak to our sisters who have spoken loud and clear about the rights of their concept in Abya Yala in Bolivia last May. The summit of Abya Yala that took place in Peru on October 15th, by the way, said as much. And women who are sick unto death, quite literally, of the ongoing violence that is visited upon them and upon girls of all ages need to be heard. We also speak out here against the violence visited upon our brothers in so many parts of this hemisphere at the hands of military, of police, and so many other sources of abuse. The microphone has been removed because the time had expired. Thank you very much. It is time to hear the member states, ladies and gentlemen, and I offer you the floor should you wish to intervene. The ambassador from Mexico, Her Excellency Maria Luz Elena Baños, has the floor. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and a good afternoon to everybody. Mexico hails everyone present here and for their energy in contributing to this important dialogue that is the preamble for our General Assembly. We ascribe the greatest importance to this particular exercise, which gives us the opportunity as member states of the OAS to hear those who are out there in the hemisphere and observing us and have something to say. There is a great diversity of opinion, this we have heard, but we understand that a fair and just exchange of views is in fact the predicate for better understanding. And to hear civil society and the international fora, we believe, can only serve to buttress the architecture of peace that we seek to make more and more inclusive. Mexico believes that its position is constructive in every one of the bodies of the organization, and we believe that our commitment to protect and defend human rights has served as a good platform from which we have looked at each one of the various resolutions that will be studied, particularly omnibus resolutions that will be submitted for a vote in the coming days. We believe that ever more fair and just societies must be looked at through this lens, as we have just heard, societies where people are considered as rights holders. Thank you. And thank you, Ambassador Baños, says the chair. I turn now to Brazil. Delegation of Brazil has the floor. Thank you very much, and good afternoon, Chair, distinguished Assistant Secretary General, representatives of civil society. It is my very great pleasure to represent Brazil at this important forum with representatives from such a broad array of civil society throughout the hemisphere at the eve of the 51st General Assembly of our meeting. We understand that the great and rich diversity of opinions that we are hearing here are very, very welcome and indeed necessary to our own consideration of the resolutions we will be considering. We think this exchange of views is essential, and wherein, through a dialogue like this, we can understand better our different points of view and strengthen our ongoing multilateral dialogue. I would like to invite all of the representatives who wish to continue to dialogue with us to do so. Let me take the opportunity also to affirm some of the priorities of the government of Brazil with regard to some of the points on our agenda today. The question of promoting within the OAS, the question of families and within the context of human rights in the time of this pandemic is something that we consider absolutely essential. And we, in fact, celebrated the International Day for Families on May 15th. This 51st General Assembly indeed sees Brazil in a stronger than ever position defending Afro-descendant rights. And we had, on the 28th of May last, a ceremony at OAS headquarters wherein a letter of ratification from Brazil of the most important OAS International Convention Against Racism and all related forms of discrimination was signed by Brazil. That was an important moment, and it stands for Brazil's position on the subject. We also were able to participate in the project of Women in Ancestral Rights, and we understand that the Inter-American Women's Commission, the SIM, and others have looked very closely at how all of these elements intertwine from a gender perspective. The LGBTIQ+ and others have been working very hard. We are members of that core group, and to that end, we believe that ongoing work to bolster ever more respect needs to be made. But Brazil, to that end, participated very actively, by the way, in the setting up since 2019 in groups also with the aim to better protect and promote the rights of people with disabilities. In El Salvador, we also worked precisely to celebrate the International Day for persons with disabilities. We also upheld the International Day for persons with Down syndrome. Last March, we signed a joint declaration particularly on that point to better understand and uphold the position of Down syndrome together with Down Syndrome International and other associated groups. And just last June, give you another idea, Brazil presented a verbal report on the Third International Group on the Inter-American Convention of the Elimination for All Forms of Discrimination Against Persons with Disability, and we subscribed it then. And I'd like to say that there is a Brazilian, Mr. Oliveira, who is chairing up that committee. And finally, let me say that our regional participation has taken us to be ever more outspoken against regimes that are repressive against their own persons, negating and trampling those human rights. Thank you for this opportunity to meet with civil society. It's been a pleasure to explain the position of Brazil in that context. Thank you very much indeed. Says the chair, we appreciate Brazil's contribution. If there's no further comment by the member states, we take note then. And before going on to the third block of interventions, since we, in fact, are doing pretty well on time, I'm going to suggest a 9-minute break. 9 minutes, not 10. So we'll come back at 4:37 Washington time.
Muy bien, pues retomamos nuestra reunión. Ahora procederemos con el tercer y último bloque de intervenciones de parte de las y los voceros de las coaliciones y actores sociales.
So we'll start with the next part of the session, the spokesman for the society, and we will continue now with Mrs. Payat, who will be speaking for the Coalition on Democracy, Freedom, Justice, and Political Renovation. Mrs. Rosa Maria Payat. Yes, we can hear you. It's an honor to speak to you from the Coalition on Democracy, Freedom, Justice, and Political Renovation. The history of our hemisphere has been a 60-year dictatorship that has led to the end of democracy in Venezuela, the support of instability in Nicaragua, and the worst democratic crisis in all the region. We know the confrontation of the sovereignty of other states by the involvement of Cuban societies and their involvement in international events, from the trafficking of persons as well as the medical brigades and the drug trafficking, the serving as refuge for terrorists sought by various states in our continent. For the Cuban people, the suffering has been worse. The thousands of Cubans who have raised their voices peacefully against democracy have suffered the social exclusion, persecution, violence, jailing, even death, as happened with my father, Obardo Baya, in an attempt done by the Secret Service in 2012. In the last 62 years, the dictatorship has condemned hundreds of thousands of political prisoners, tortured thousands, like many of the demonstrators of 11J, and has many generations of Cubans live without the most basic human rights. But the people have said, this is it, that's it. We want our own freedom and life. On the 11th of July, many people went to the streets and started breaking down the iron wall in our hemisphere. As a result, the regime has declared a public war against civil society and the people. On the next 15th of November, for instance, there will be massive demonstrations, and the state's response has been to distribute weapons amongst workers, students, and paramilitary who are forced to participate in repressive commandos under the supervision of the national police. It is important to have solidarity in the nations of the Americas and to mobilize democracy in Cuba, or it runs the risk of being squashed in the 2021. That's why we urge that the canceling of the special session last July to analyze the situation in Cuba was unwarranted. We urge you to listen to the civil society of Cuba and the Secretariat. We can ask you to condemn the regime and use the tools of the inter-American system to defend the right to democracy for the peoples of Cuba, and with that, the rights of all the peoples of the Americas. Please don't leave us alone. Thank you very much. Thank you, Bayet. Next, we will hear the speech by the Coalition for the Progress of Society, and the spokesman is Elsa Adne Mendez Alvarez from the Center for Comprehensive New International Life. You have the floor, madam. Good afternoon. Do you hear me? Good afternoon. Yes, we hear you perfectly well. If there's any lesson from the pandemic after 2 years of its appearance, is that the family is the only institution able to sustain and support society. The family served as the refuge, the hospital, the school, the recreation center, welcome center, distributed hope, the business, workshop. It was a series of opportunities that allowed for human development. The family is the basic element of society where all of its members can fully develop, and it is the place where education is provided and where human and Christian values are taught. That's why we have to defend and protect the family. The family is the most important institution. It precedes the state, and that's why its situation has a determining influence on the well-being of a population. It has been proven through many social studies that to invest in a family is much more effective than to invest in other sectors, other groups or persons. The family, as the generator of social well-being, must be the central object of all public policy, and to include the family perspective as the means that values the individual and that gives sense and meaning to life. It's part of the vital expression of an individual and for social development. There are already examples that this is possible. In Querétaro, Mexico, an initiative was approved in this regard. And in Guatemala, the president, Alejandro Yamatei, is betting on a model that should be replicated in other member states. Public policy for the defense of life and institutionality of family. 99 government actions that favor the establishment of a fairer and more solidarity society. As a mother, wife, Mexican woman, I raise my voice to demand that we respect the lives of all human beings in their most vulnerable phase, that is, in the womb, and respect the natural family, respect the autonomy of member states, and respect the foundational documents, and stop imposing an agenda that distorts the meaning and purpose of human rights. Without respect for life, there is no peace. Without respect for the family, there is no development. Without respect for the fundamental freedoms, there is no democracy. So let us make the family cause a continental cause. Let us treat the family as a political priority for all states. Let's make of the Americas the family continent. Thank you. Thank you, Mrs. Mendes. Next, we have Mr. Clement Chatier from the Métis Nation, who will speak on behalf of the Indigenous Nations and Organizations Coalition. You have the floor, Mr. Chartier. Yeah, but I corrected it, I think.
Has run its 4-year mandate without having reached its objectives. In light of the pandemic and the greater need for an action plan for implementation of the declaration, we urge this sitting of the Assembly to extend the plan of action for another 4 years or more, along with increased initiatives and measures to ensure its success. In this sense, we encourage all member states to contribute to a fund to enable the OAS to do its work, and that the plan is in fact carried out. Further, we call upon the Secretary General to set up a process of engagement between Indigenous peoples and member states in order to explore mechanisms necessary to drive Indigenous peoples' direct participation within the OAS, as well as initiatives to promote the declaration and implementation of a renewed plan of action, including ongoing consultation with Indigenous peoples. In closing, we thank His Excellency, Secretary General Almagro, for participating in 2 virtual interactive meetings with the American Council of Indigenous Peoples in April and September of this year. Merci, gracias, thank you, merci.
Muchas gracias, señor Chartier. Ahora continuamos con la intervención.
Thank you, Mr. Chartier. Now we have the presentation of Mrs. Mariela Leon, the spokesman for freedom of conscience and expression. You have the floor. Thank you very much. Your Excellencies, ambassadors, and representatives of member states, Anuncio Martí are 2 Paraguayan citizens who have been part of the industry of kidnapping since '52. After more than 50 years, they've set up an organization. Juan Ramón Garta is a Honduran trafficker for torture and assassination. Tomás Mascot is a U.S. citizen who ran through the streets of San Jose, Costa Rica, looking for children to give them drugs, abuse them sexually, and distribute videos of these rapes. What is the common thread of all these 3 cases? All these persons have been defended by the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. And together with this, the same commission has attacked and restricted the rights of other persons. For instance, Dolores Gabriel was the baby of Maria Hernandez Mendez de Castro, known as Manuela. She gave to birth. The mother took off the umbilical cord, and he died asphyxiated in the hospital. Manuela's conduct was defended by the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, while her child was invisible. The child, because of had to abort against her express will and the will of her parents through a forced pregnancy. And the Inter-American Commission put pressure to perpetrate that crime. Yesterday alone, they said that to listen to the voice and the will of adolescents was important. It seems that it's not the voice of those who don't wish to abort. Last month, the Inter-American Court made a pronouncement on saying that an echogram is greater crime than abortion, and stigmatized those as anti-rights. The distinguished ambassadors, the correction of mistakes in the judicial processes can be praiseworthy, but the double decisions of the Commission are unacceptable. While defending drug traffickers and condemning those who believe in religious freedom as enshrined in the Inter-American Convention on Human Rights, this leads to a severe distortion of rights that does not represent the rights and interests of the people. And those who believe we're wrong, I invite you to come to Honduras, Costa Rica, or Paraguay to ask the people what they think about paying a compensation to kidnappers and drug traffickers or pedophiles. Distinguished ambassadors, judge for yourselves what is the double standard we are talking about, where the worst criminal does not seem to commit the worst mistakes. Instead, those of us who have a broader and more restrictive version of the rights of all human beings, the right to life, to the right to family, to freedom of conscience, to belief, and to expression. A renewed America should be a fair America. Thank you very much. Thank you. If we continue with our agenda, we will now listen to Mrs. Andrea Garzón from the association We Share a World, Compartimos Mundo, for the Coalition of Access to Justice and the Rule of Law. Go ahead, Mrs. Garzón. Thank you very much, and good afternoon. A renewed America could not be such if this organization of American states and its institutions are not renewed. The lack of sticking to what has been agreed to by states, lack of accountability, the limited focus on topics that are not a priority to the region, the lack of impartiality in all authorities, as well as the promotion of remote agendas that do not reflect the needs of people. This is why there's been a loss of credibility and economic support by countries to this organization and its institutions. Our coalition has been working to appeal to countries and their representatives to work to make sure that the organization focuses on the issues that affect our population: hunger, poverty, the lack of access to education, the lack of access to basic health services. These are realities that our people understand and that are far from having been met. For instance, up until the end of 2020, we had 22 million more poor. The region has 22 doctors for every 10,000 inhabitants, and it's calculated that 120 million children of school age lost one school year. And on the opposite side, we see the priorities of this organization, which seem to be reflected in resolutions that were approved for this session. Just to refer to one, in the Omnibus on Human Rights, there is zero mention of poverty, zero mention of access to education, zero mention of the need to health, and only 3 mentions of access to health. But unfortunately, it's limited to sexual and reproductive health of women. Well, yeah, of course, that serves their agenda, but not the real needs of women in our region. This is important to note, distinguished ambassadors and representatives of the OAS, that we, the organizations that are part of this coalition, work untiringly with very limited resources to help the most needy. We don't devote ourselves to lobbying or litigation. We fight for the lives of thousands of persons, whether they are born or unborn. And in the meantime, the authorities of this organization, far from supporting our work, call us anti-rights, even though each and every one of the rights we defend, life, the family, freedom of expression, freedom of conscience, freedom of expression, education, health, just to mention a few, are expressly protected by the Inter-American Convention on Human Rights. The convention, which is being ignored today. Worse yet, it's being reinterpreted and reinvented by the entities of this organization, including the Inter-American Court and the Commission. That is why we appeal to the authorities of this organization, and in particular to the distinguished ambassadors who are representing their states and their populations. It is your responsibility to protect the national legislation that exists in your countries and that has been put in by those who have been legitimately elected to those positions. That means that the sovereignty of your states is made valid. You must defend what was expressly agreed to by your states instead of allowing the imposition of agendas from an organization that does not reflect the internal reality of our countries. Thank you very much, Mrs. Garzon. Now we will hear Mr. Franco David Matas from the Youth Alternative, who will present the Coalition on Youth and Freedoms. Mr. Matas, you have the floor. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and distinguished delegates and ambassadors. We live in an era that requires leaders that can meet the challenges facing our peoples, challenges that mainly affect our youth. We need leaders that defend the rights and fundamental freedoms so that we can develop and enjoy a life of peace. The theme of this assembly is we seek a renewed America, but how can we find that renewed America when there are sectors that propose systematically and intentionally confrontation, as if we were trying to deal with a war between men and women, between the rich and the poor, those who have lighter skin, those who have darker skin, those who are believers and non-believers. They impose ideological agendas and anti-scientific ones, such as gender, violating freedom of thought, and they're imposing violence. We cannot speak about a renewed America when throughout our continent we are being led by governments that inspired by the so-called gender agenda or progressive agenda, which has very little progress and renewal. And it leads to peak unemployment in our countries. Our economies are collapsing, and the governments are adopting laws against fundamental rights, the right to life, giving priority above all to abortion and euthanasia. While the governments of Americas look aside at what's going on in Cuba and Venezuela, the victims of communist tyrannies, our governors impose public policies based on these failed policies that do not reflect the reality of our citizens. And likewise, the states and international organizations are becoming more involved in our families and teaching us how they should or should not teach their children. Hemispheric insecurity and poverty continues to grow, and it seems that their goal is to arbitrarily ignore our problems. For all these reasons, we stand before you and say, please pay attention to the concerns of the Americans and stop creating false dichotomies. Mr. Ambassadors, we urge you not to be indifferent, that you deal with the real problems, with real solutions. We don't want ideological policies. Deal with reality. We want policies and values that defend all human beings and the family as the basic and fundamental cell of humanity. We want leaders that are not influenced by lobbies and money. We don't want them to be marionettes. We have obtained 60,000 signatures throughout the Americas that say something very clear. We need politicians with courage. Only with your commitment and action can we recover from the failure, the future of each one of our nations and peoples. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Matas. Now I call on the Coalition for the Self-Determination of Peoples versus Institutional Corruption, who is represented by Andrea Velasquez from the Association Family, Development, and Population. Mrs. Velasquez, you have the floor. Distinguished Secretary General, Ms. Lisa Almagro, and all distinguished guests, I'd like to begin by asking all ambassadors who have taken the time to listen to the voice of civil society in the Americas that wants to be heard. And I am one of those spokesmen. Recently, we celebrated the International Day of Freedom of Religion, which is a basic fundamental right covered by Article 12 of the Inter-American Convention on Human Rights. And I'd like to say the following. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the right to religious freedom was undermined by many of the governments in the region, and therefore forgetting that this is a fundamental right and it's intrinsic to human beings. The labor of the state is to guarantee the right, but it cannot cancel it and prohibit it as it has been doing. We are very concerned that this is becoming standard and it's becoming a trend. Another right that they've tried to undermine, the right to freedom of religion. The case Pares versus Chile, where the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and today the Inter-American Court seek to interfere in the decisions and autonomy of all religions to determine their own belief and religious practices, to live according to them, and to decide who is able to instruct that religion or not. The Commission has raised this case to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, even though all the Chilean tribunals agreed that there should be no interference on internal decisions of the Church. We know that this case before the court is not a case against the Catholic Church. It's a case against the right of all religions and all persons to believe what they want and to honor their beliefs. The right to freedom of religion is also the right of parents to educate their own children according to their own convictions. However, we're seeing a widespread trend on the part of governments in the region to try to replace the role of the parents by indoctrinating our children with ideologies that go against the nature of the human being and corrupting their innocence. In this obsession to corrupt our children, which are condemned and qualified as terrorists for those parents who have been courageous enough to complain against the perversion taught in the schools, which has mean as a result that girls are sexually abused because they give access to people in the bathrooms who were not born as a woman, as has occurred recently in the United States. And finally, these attacks and marginalization of us. In spite of it, we continue to work and participate and raise our voice to defend freedom of religion. We will not go back in this fight. Thank you. Thank you, Mrs. Velasquez. Continuing with our list, I invite Gilberto Fabián Maldonado of the National Front Pro Vida and Pro Familia in Paraguay to speak, to present the Coalition for Life and Family.
I hope I can be heard. Yes. I'm pleased to greet the representatives of the member states and the Assistant Secretary General of this organization. I here am speaking on behalf of the Asociación Familia, Desarrollo y Población, Family Development and People, with regard to the rights to women. We work for the well-being of women, of children as yet unborn, children who are born, and adolescents. We hold up the importance of a womanhood in all of the roles that women, in fact, play as young girls, as growing women, as mothers, as grandmothers. And we see men, of course, for all of the important contributions that men have. And we bemoan the reductionist view of so many at the OAS as if certain beliefs with regard to women were seen to be inimical with development. It is very, very regrettable that both the CIM, the Inter-American Commission on Women, and the Commission have such a reductionist view of women, contrary to what it might first appear. We believe that these fora must be more embracing, must be more inclusive as to all of the roles, as to the entire scope that women bring and that femininity brings. The role of a mother who, together with a father, build a family as the predicate, the bedrock of our societies. Now, ladies and gentlemen, from the standpoint of what really roots society, surely that is family. It has, to that end, to speak of the importance of responsible maternity and paternity, an understanding of a woman's necessary access to education and to work so that she may quite properly have access to the many dimensions that will fulfill her being along with motherhood. There has to be further a battle brought to the tremendously powerful industry of pornography, which in and of itself is the source of innumerable crimes and ongoing sexism. It is important to do better to protect our women, our wives, our mothers, our daughters. It's important to understand that we must protect the deep rights and value of women. Thank you very much, Mr. Fabián, says the chair. Pleased to give the floor now to Dr. Eduardo Vargas, who represents Agencia Pública Interamericana, who will speak for the Inter-American Coalition for a Political and Social Advance. Thank you very much. Secretary General, Assistant Secretary General, Mr. Chairman, member states, members of civil society, the motto, the great aim of this General Assembly is the Americas and renewable therein. We believe that to that end we need better intervention. In 2019, the great slogan was to innovate. Last year, it was about collaboration to build resiliency and reduce vulnerability in a time of this era. But today, when we look at what we are facing, resilience and ongoing innovation seem to be the twin aims we should hold before us. Our coalition was created 2 years ago, particularly with a view to create a space hemispherically to look into investigation and a better use of innovative tools to add value to the public and to offer a better answer to the great challenges of the Americas. We think that Article 53 of the Charter of the OAS should be borne in mind, which allows the General Assembly of the OAS to generate new entities. And we think there should be a new laboratory of innovation in social and economic spheres. That should be a sphere to promote, indeed, innovation in the public sphere, and we can only hope that this might lead to a better targeted support for the member states. This, of course, should rest on full participation in the hemisphere, North, South, Caribbean, Central, and that there the emphasis should be, as it is in the general entities of the OAS, democracy, human rights, development, security, those 4 pillars. And we hope that perhaps next time when we meet in a General Assembly, we can decide what kind of a laboratory this might be, because we're thinking in terms of a laboratory between 2022 and 2026, so that there, yes, we might aspire to a renovated America. And this hinges on what we decide to do. Thank you, Mr. Vargas. To conclude this particular segment, we're pleased to listen to representative of a colleague representing the Coalition for Venezuela from the Barranquilla Association. Hunger, disease, shortages, and insecurity, criminality are all progressing apace in our country, our beloved Venezuela. We have listened with great attention to all of the points made here, comments on the challenges that we all face respectively. But ladies and gentlemen, Chair of the Permanent Council, Secretary General, Assistant Secretary General, heads of delegation, dear friends all, an America that shall be renewed must look more carefully at the migrants, at the refugees who have had to leave their home. We Venezuelans are roaming the hemisphere from Central America and the Caribbean, South and North, running tremendous risks at the hands of human traffickers, sexual exploitation, and so many other disasters. But our role has tried to be strategic to promote innovation in the communities that receive us. Let's not forget that answers are often much more pertinent when they truly involve those whom they seek to protect. And we have seen over these last couple of years resources channeled towards Venezuelan refugees will continue to be insufficient so long as better measures aren't taken to ensure that that migration is done more regularly through development and through greater security to boost everyone's economic security post-pandemic. The reasons behind the Venezuelan disaster need to be tackled. We cannot put this off further. We must continue to exhort Venezuela to comply with the charter. On behalf of the more than 90 members of the Coalition for Venezuela, I call on all you to promote and protect the Venezuelan citizens that are migrating. Second, to open up a broad humanitarian corridor that would allow an orderly and protected channel through which these migrants could flow. Third, without distinction, that migrants be afforded public health measures, including access to vaccination. basic elements for social development throughout the Americas. A strengthening of this throughout the hemisphere is essential. That is the commitment of the Coalition for Venezuela, and that is our statement. Thank you. Thank you. Next, we're pleased to invite Ms. Gina Valores of the Association Women Against Violence, who will speak for the Coalition of Communities of African Descent. This is Silvana Verissimo of that Coalition of Communities of African Descent. If you, says the technical expert to the speaker, if you could activate both your microphone, madam, and your video, that would be great. We see you and hear you now. Very good. Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Yes, indeed. Go right ahead. Well, a good afternoon to everybody. On behalf of the Coalition of Communities of African Descent, let me seize this opportunity to share with you the truly alarming situation of the Black population in the Caribbean. I say alarming, and I mean it. Why? Because there are alarming cases of racism, of a murder, and of kidnapping of African descendant leaders. Genocide of Black youth, which is growing exponentially. Between 2020, the number of Black women that were assassinated because they were women and Black increased, are you ready for this? By 54%, 54%. The women who were murdered dropped by 10% over that same period. The criminality, the attacks on defenders of human rights, men and women, particularly when they deal with Black women, has been debated widely in all of our countries. It's no secret, because they are the ones hardest hit by the lack of vibrant and effective public policies that might help the whole of the Black population in terms of their access to justice and to basic needs, which the member states of this organization, you would think, should really care about and do something about. Talk is cheap, and we need to do more. Our people are in a deplorable state. Now, when the United Nations looked at the situation in Colombia and the question of racial discrimination was looked at between 2016 to 2017, more than 704 Black leaders were killed. Every 72 hours, a Black leader was killed. Now, the state, does it not, has the obligation to protect all its citizens. Now, when COVID struck, as you can imagine, our situation has become all the more complex, and so we cry out and recommend that the Afro population of Latin America and the Caribbean be able to have integral access to vaccination in every area, at the level of the quilombolas, palenqueras, wherever they are, in the rural areas, in the city, wherever you want. We are everywhere, and we need help. Emergency help. So too in terms of help for jobs. Because if jobs have gone south, you may be certain that for Blacks, they're further down than for everybody else. We beg the governments to do more, to comply with their convention duties, such as the Durban Pact. And thank you very much for hearing me. Thank you. We now, says the chair, have the pleasure of turning to the member states, should any of you wish to take the floor to refer to what has been raised. And Canada has the floor. Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman. I am pleased to be able to speak French. I'll move to English a little later, but it has been a genuine pleasure and a privilege to participate in this important dialogue, to hear the representatives of various coalitions of civil society, and to hear so vibrantly their summary of where they stand, what their viewpoints are, and what they're aiming for, particularly how they have responded through their various lenses to the pandemic, because we know that this entire region has been very badly hit by the pandemic, quite likely more so than anywhere else on earth. This has been said time and again. All the more so hitting women and girls, all the more. And there has been progress, yes, but we know very well that more needs to be made for us to truly move to rebuild after this cataclysm.
Society step up and play a critical role in providing support to countless people across our hemisphere and advocate for inclusive recovery efforts. Civil society plays an indispensable role in the defense of democracy in our region, including by protecting democratic spaces in which public debate can occur. This has been especially important during the pandemic, and I would like to echo the comments made earlier by the Secretary General and by others on this very matter. I would like to take this opportunity to thank you for the work you have done and continue to do towards pandemic response and recovery. I would also like to highlight the contribution of civil society to the OAS itself. Canada believes that civil society and other actors play a critical role at the organization. You bring unique experiences, perspectives, and new ideas which allow us to achieve more and attain greater results. I would like to recognize in particular the participation of Indigenous people today in today's dialogue. Canada believes that the inclusion of Indigenous peoples and perspectives is critical to the work that the OAS, the work of the OAS, and should inform the decisions that we take as an organization, including at this General Assembly. We have listened attentively to the presentations made here today by Indigenous leaders and by civil society representatives. As many of you have stated, in order to build a more sustainable region and in order to achieve renewal in the Americas, we must support democracy, promote and protect human rights, advance gender equality, and create safer, greener, and more inclusive societies. This is a goal that Canada will continue to work towards, but that can only be accomplished by working together with all of you. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Muchas gracias, François. Tiene ahora la palabra.
Thank you very much, Francois. I'm pleased to give the floor to the delegation of Paraguay, Martin. Thanks very much, Chair. I'm going to be very, very brief. Greetings to you all. Deeply grateful to all of the representatives of civil society who have honored us with their presence and their vibrant participation this afternoon. We're very well aware of the importance of a dialogue being maintained and being fostered with all of you on the basis of our shared view of the Americas as a zone that seeks renewal, as Guatemala has asked us to bear in mind at this General Assembly. Now, we've heard here a broad variety, a very broad spectrum of ideas and opinions, and that's what democracy is all about, is it not? Dialogue is essential to it. And Paraguay certainly will continue betting on and counting with the freedom of expression of us all, without any discrimination. And so I can only hope that we will continue to put our heads together and be free and speak out with regard to the various different views. We cannot live in a bubble and not listen and not care. We should aim to consolidate our democracies and to move forward. Thank you very much. Thank you, Paraguay, says the chair. Right then, ladies and gentlemen, there appear to be no further requests for the floor by member states, and this brings us to the end of this dialogue. It remains for me to thank you most sincerely for your participation, for your views, and for your very, very active participation. We look forward to continue to work with you in civil society, and please know we deeply value your work day to day. Thanks to you all. This meeting stands adjourned.